Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast series focusing on critical business decisions. Brought to you by Brady Ware & Company. Brady Ware is a regional, full-service accounting and advisory firm that helps businesses and entrepreneurs make visions a reality.
Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast giving you, the listener, clear vision to make great decisions. In each episode, we discuss the process of decision-making on a different topic from the business owner's or executive's perspective. We aren't necessarily telling you what to do, but we can put you in a position to make an informed decision on your own and understand when you might need help along the way. My name is Mike Blake, and I'm your host for today's program. I'm a director at Brady Ware & Company, a full-service accounting firm based in Dayton, Ohio, with offices in Dayton, Columbus, Ohio, Richmond, Indiana, and Alpharetta, Georgia. Brady Ware is sponsoring this podcast, which is being recorded in Atlanta per social distancing protocols. If you would like to engage with me on social media with my chart of the day or other content, I'm on LinkedIn as myself and at Unblakeable on Facebook, Twitter, Clubhouse, and Instagram. If you like this podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast aggregator, and please consider leaving a review of the podcast as well. Today's topic is, should I be open about my mental illness? 1 in 5 U.S. adults report that they suffer with some sort of mental illness, and an estimated 2.5% of U.S. adults experience bipolar disorder at some point in their lifetimes. 7.1% of U.S. adults are characterized as having major depression. And these are numbers that go back to 2019. And in case you haven't heard, most of us had kind of a rough year in 2020. We had a combination of a once-in-a-century global pandemic. We had unprecedented massive social upheaval, and in some places in the country, we had murder hornets. And, for a lot of us, it's been a rough ride, a lot rougher than usual. And most of us, I'm sure, have read and seen many stories of the mental toll that the pandemic has taken on many of us, ranging from job loss to being cooped up at home to having to take on home roles that we were not prepared for. For example, I am the world's lousiest Spanish teacher for homeschooling our son, which was not necessarily our plan. We can only hope he can order a Taco Bell, because I think that's the only thing I'm qualifying him to do, but he's 10, he might grow out of it. And, you think about mental illness and I'm hoping that kind of one good thing that comes out of the pandemic is I hope it makes us more aware of mental illness and kind of gives it its due. Years ago, I served on the board of a nonprofit called Care and Counseling Center of Georgia, whose mission was to provide mental health care services to low-income folks. And they did a really good job of it, in spite of my being on the board. But one of the things you learn about mental health and you actually learn about two things. Number one is, mental health has still sort of been a backseat, kind of taken a backseat to so-called physical health. And, you grow up and you talk about people who are either tough or they're not tough. And some people of faith will claim that makes them impervious to any kind of mental illness and so forth, even to the point where, it wasn't that long ago where I think a lot of people thought the mental illness was a choice. And secondly, I think, people are understanding now that it, not only does it need to be destigmatized, but the thing about mental health is that if you don't have mental health, then a lot of bad downstream things happen, right? They can happen at the micro level, where it impacts your job, it impacts your personal relationships, it impacts your ability to be a fully engaged, fully actualized member of society, a fully actualized person. And in very extreme cases, particularly in the United States where gun ownership is plentiful, mental illness that is either undiagnosed, untreated, unmonitored, simply not paid enough attention to, can have, frankly, catastrophic results. And I can't help but wonder, how different might our world be if we gave, frankly, mental illness its due. And I think now we're entering this trans-pandemic phase where many of us are becoming vaccinated. We're starting to kind of wrestle with returning to work. We're wrestling with returning to restaurants, going back to baseball games and so forth. And, the mental health issues aren't going away. In fact, you could argue that there are more mental health issues that are going to be created by sending people back to the office. And I think, and I hope that one thing is abundantly clear, that mental health simply cannot be ignored anymore. It's not the moral thing to do. And I would argue it's not the business correct thing to do, because if you have even a small business of 25 people, statistically speaking, 5% of them, 5 of those people are really struggling with a diagnosable disorder. And one of them probably has something akin to bipolar disorder, and they've just done a very good job of hiding it, or we've done a very good job of not seeing it. And so therefore I wanted to cover this topic. It's not an easy topic. I'm certainly not a physician. But I think it's so important that I think we have to equip ourselves. We have to, statistically speaking, again, there are thousands of listeners listening to this that are struggling with this question. And then for people like me, who at least I don't believe that I have a diagnosable mental illness, others may disagree, but I don't believe that I do. But I do want to make sure that every resource is available in my network and my company, of which I'm a shareholder, that if there are folks, and again, statistically speaking, there are a number of people that are struggling with mental illness of some kind, that we as a company do the right thing, that we are compassionate, that we are accommodating, and that we stand up for them, and we don't abandon them. We don't try to force them into the shadows. And so I hope that thesis makes sense to you as we kind of listen, we kind of go through, I think, what is a very challenging and necessary topic. And joining us today to help us talk about this is Jacqui Chew. Jacqui works at the intersection of storytelling, innovation, and business. And I've known her for a long time. In fact, I took over her office once. She deploys the power of narrative design in reframing an organization's brand story for resonance and to inspire action. Described as a Lara Croft of problem solving, Jacqui is a seasoned business operator with a passion for building inclusive teams and working cross-functionally to bring disparate groups together towards a common goal. As the curator and licensee of TEDxAtlanta, Jacqui is always on the lookout for change makers and innovations that are solving for the challenges of today and those just around the corner. Under her leadership, first of TEDx Peachtree from 2009 to 2018, and presently of TEDxAtlanta, Atlanta has grown in recognition within the global TEDx community as an innovation hub for technology, healthcare, and social impact initiatives. And I'm a big fan of TEDx. I watch probably 3 to 4 TEDx videos a week. And I've watched Jacqui's video as well, and we'll refer to that in our conversation. Jacqui is resourceful, tenacious, and well-networked in the Atlanta business, social impact, and technology communities. Jacqui Chew, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
So, Jacqui, I brought you on because you've chosen to hold yourself out there as a person that has bipolar disorder and has figured out how to navigate life with that particular disorder. So, I've read about bipolar disorder. Thank God I don't have it. I don't have a family member that has it. I have a couple friends that have. But explain to the audience in your kind of best terms, how would you describe bipolar disorder to somebody?
Gosh, so first of all, I would call it a mood disorder because the symptoms manifest itself in extremes in mood. In mood changes. And this isn't to be confused with a person who is moody, quote unquote, but mood changes from the standpoint of severe depression to the point where you would lose interest in what you normally enjoy. Or you have a really severe depression episode would be if you are unable to sleep and you find yourself crying uncontrollably at absolutely nothing. Severe fatigue. So these are these are severe manifestations of depression. So there's that aspect of it. Now, at worst, at the worst, in terms of depression, the worst manifestation of a symptom on the depression side is suicide, thoughts of self-harm, and in some cases, self-harm. So that's that part of it. The other side of the equation, or the other end of the pendulum, is mania and manic episodes. So mania is generally characterized as severe anger to the point of violence. So, for instance, this individual that I know from our support group sessions has, when he is in mania, he specifically does not drive. He actually specifically has stopped driving because there are certain types of traffic situations that trigger his symptoms and cause him to act out and in violence. Other unexpected symptoms of mania is excessive shopping. Maxing out on credit cards. And then yet another is hypersexuality, which can be really, really hard. Now, I'm not a doctor. These are sort of observations and sharings over the years since, I've been going to group support group sessions since 2005. So over the years, these are some of the experiences that my fellow attendees have shared with the group, and so these are some of the symptoms. So it can manifest. It's generally two opposite extremes experienced by an individual, and each of those extremes could be experienced by the person for a couple hours, couple of weeks. I'll give you an example. There was I remember a point in time when I wasn't diagnosed, in which I remember staying up for 3 days and going through a complete cleaning of my house. Now, I did end up with a very clean condo, but I didn't realize at the time that I was going through. I was experiencing mania. In that I wasn't able to sleep. I was hyperactive. There was just a lot of energy, and I was probably I was testier and quicker to anger than normal. And this went on for a couple of weeks, as I recall. Now, looking back after my diagnosis in 2005, I recognized through my therapy sessions that these moments in time or periods in my life that I had just dismissed as, just me being the eccentric me that I am, were actually symptoms. I was experiencing episodes. That was a very long explanation. So,
well, I think it deserves it, and for the audience listening at home too, I think bipolar disorder until recently was more commonly known as manic depressive disorder. Correct?
Yes.
That's sort of the new, or maybe that's the clinical. And I'm not sure why the name changed, but if it sounds like manic depressive disorder, the answer is that, well, yeah, because it is. So I watched your video and you talked about you described a time, which I guess is 15, 16 years ago, when you kind of came to a crisis point, effectively, where you sought specific medical attention. And I want to come to that, but before I get to that particular moment, I'm curious. Before you got to that moment, was there a gradual kind of trail of breadcrumbs, if you will, of increasingly frequent or severe symptoms that led you to that point where you said, "Man, this is not right. This is not what most human beings have to go through," or, as is the case with something like schizophrenia, did one day all of a sudden, or in a very short period of time, you simply became bipolar? Does it work one of the two ways? Did you have one of those two experiences?
I can't speak for my peers, but I can tell you, for me, I had no idea that anything was wrong with me.
Yeah.
Because that period of time of 3 days where I stayed up and cleaned my loft. I mean, I think that was back in 2004. And I wasn't diagnosed until towards the end of January of 2005. And the reason why I know this is because it was and I talk about this in my TED talk. It was an evening. I was watching Jeopardy, and then I was crying while I was watching Jeopardy, which is not something that you would normally do. Now, I didn't think very much of it, actually, which is kind of strange in and of itself now in hindsight. And the next day, going into work, I found myself, essentially just staring at a document for a very long time. It didn't seem like a very long time, but it turned out to be a very long time. And then realizing that I wasn't processing any of the words that I was looking at. And that was when it was like a stroke of panic. It was a surge of panic, where I just said, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what was wrong. So I called my regular doctor, and it was an emergency. I called him and I explained what had happened. Didn't explain the night before and the crime, but I just explained to him that I really couldn't understand anything that I was reading. He was clearly concerned, and he gave me the names of 3 doctors and phone numbers. Now that in and of itself was a little strange, because I could write numbers and read numbers, but I couldn't really write the names of the doctors and read it back to myself. I don't really know how to explain that. So I had to remember. So I essentially just remembered the first name and wrote down the first number, because that's all that I could process at the time. And so I was, I was very fortunate. Now, I called that particular doctor, that psychiatrist. Now, he couldn't see me for a month and a half. I mean, that kind of tells you 2005, our healthcare system was just not geared toward helping people with mental health challenges. So unless, of course, had I said to my doctor that I thought about killing myself, I had thoughts of self-harm, that would have been a whole different ball of wax.
Right. You have to move to the front of the line at that point.
Pretty much. And actually, there's another story about that. I'll explain that in a second. So I basically couldn't, there wasn't a slot in time for 6 weeks. I made the appointment, wrote down a date, and then I was very fortunate, because a few days later, the doctor's office called me and said, hey, we have cancellation. Would you like to come in? Are you available to come in? And I did. So that was super fortunate for me, because at that point in time, I was starting to hallucinate. And I didn't know, I knew I was hallucinating, because there's no way that I was hanging off of the rafters in my loft, with a noose around my neck. I knew that wasn't happening. So I knew I was hallucinating. So that began my journey, till today. So that was how it all began.
So when you were first diagnosed, did you feel that you had to hide your condition? Did you feel like you sort of had to tell the whole world? Did it not make an impact if you felt like, it's just like being told I have arthritis? How did you kind of emotionally react to that?
Well, so you have to think, you have to remember, this is 2005, before people could talk about these things.
Yep.
Before it was normal, before, ADHD in your kid was something to be ashamed of, still at the time, or, people would talk about their kids in questions like, my child has autism, or it's just, none of this was okay to talk about. And so I'm thinking about, becoming an evangelist or raising awareness. I wasn't. I had no idea, first of all, what this is all about. I went out first of all, I wasn't diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was diagnosed. My original diagnosis was schizophrenia.
Huh.
Which, there are similarities in symptoms. I mean, the fact that I was seeing myself hanging from the rafters and I was hearing voices, that is classic schizophrenia symptoms. So I was diagnosed that way, and I was prescribed medication for that, and along with going into talk therapy with my psychiatrist, and he also recommended that I go to a support group on a regular basis. So I didn't know that it was a lifelong condition, that there is no cure. I had no clue. And it was one of those, I thought, all right, so if I take my meds, I do all the things that my doctor wanted me to do, I'm going to be okay. All of this will stop and I can just move on. And so this is 2005, and I did. And then for the longest time, I just assumed that I'd be fine taking the med. Now, we did find out 6 weeks later or 2 months later that, the schizophrenia diagnosis was incorrect. It was bipolar disorder, because my hallucinations receded once I was putting into place some of the sleep hygiene, is the official term, like not taking the television out of your bedroom. By the way, you cannot, should not, no one should be watching television and going to sleep. It's really bad for you. I can't tell you the science behind it. It was explained to me, I forget, but it's really bad. And so just practicing good sleep hygiene, getting 8 hours of sleep, ensuring that it's really deep REM, restful sleep. Those were measures that I took. And, after when I went back, my 6-week visit, it was hallucinations that got away. Some of the other symptoms were still persisted, and he was able to give me a correct diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And then we went from there. So I was in no way thinking about telling people. It was more about getting well. How do I get well? How do I ensure that I can cognitively process reading words? I'm a knowledge worker. It's what I do for a living. I'm a writer. I tell stories. I create messaging. I help entrepreneurs with their positioning. And if I'm unable to be on my game from a cognitive function point of view, then I don't have a way to be self-sufficient. And so that, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You first have to take care of your bare essentials. And because I was living on my own, my family is still 10,000 miles away. I essentially was my own person, my own provider, and I had to take care of myself. So that was the sole focus. I have to tell you that this erroneous notion that bipolar could be cured, and after a period of time, I could just go back to doing all the things that I used to do that may not necessarily have been good for me, was a really bad thing and catastrophic, because I had a relapse in a really severe episode of 15 months, starting February-ish of 2008. And I didn't come out of it till July, August of 2009.
And that's something I think is very underappreciated, maybe unappreciated about mental illness, is that, and again, I'm not a doctor either, but I'm not aware of any mental illness that is considered curable, right? I've never heard a psychiatrist say, I cured somebody of X or Y. It's all about, right now with current state of the art science, it's all about treatment. and management, right? But it again, unless there's a radical shift in technology, it ain't going away. And if you're afflicted in some way like that, then it's just going to be your companion.
Right. Well, it's amazing. We know we have gone so far or come so far in terms of technological advancements, advancements in all kinds of areas, but scientists are still somewhat mystified by the brain and how it works.
Yep.
And they do know that it's a chemical imbalance. It is truly a chemical imbalance. They're not entirely sure what causes it altogether. They know that there is, it could, some types of bipolar disorder, and there are 4 types. Some types are triggered by damage to the hippocampus part of the brain. Some of it is, it has to do with the neurotransmitters not firing the right way. So there are there's not a lot of clarity. And then of course there's environmental factors as well. That there are theories that it's genetics. Actually, it's not a theory. They've done experiments and they've seen with twins, and they've seen that mood disorders, there's a genetic underpinning to those to mood disorders, and environmental factors like extreme stress or death in the family or substance abuse. Those factors could trigger symptoms.
So I want to kind of seize on that a little bit, grab a hold of that for a little bit, because you mentioned in your video that you had to implement a certain rule because there's one certain work trigger that you highlighted. So I was wondering if you could talk about that and has it worked?
So, yeah, you are referring, Mike, to the no asshole rule?
I am indeed. And thanks for coming on the podcast anyway. I hope you're all right. I think so. So there in bipolar, in mood disorders, there's, like for me, there are stressors and there are triggers. Okay. So stressors are conditions that make it very, very, that kind of exacerbate that gives me a heightened sense of stress, hence stressors, which then triggers a certain emotion. Triggers are literally, like, for me, I can't speak for the rest of my peers here, but for me, there are certain behaviors, certain personality types, and sometimes in some cases, certain phrases that trigger me to anger, to behave in a certain way that I have no control over. And they also trigger or they trigger such an overwhelming sense of doubt and fear and shame even that I have no control over. It's completely irrational, but I have no control over it. And so the no asshole rule has everything to do with a certain kind of personality that unfortunately is quite persistent in the technology, I dare say, industry. There's no shortage of assholes. Yeah.
Yes.
And we make more.
So when I say asshole, what I mean is that there are certain traits, like, people who always demand more, and they move the goalpost.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all experienced coworkers or managers like that who they demand without ever providing positive reinforcement. And when a certain goal had been attained, instead of taking a moment to acknowledge, appreciate, they move the goalpost just a little bit further. And for me, that's the kind of, that sort of personality is a trigger for me. And so I've tried very, very hard to steer away from working with people like that. And in many cases, I've had to develop coping mechanisms. So you'll hear that a lot if you talk to, if you come to my group support session, we talk about coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
And just techniques to moderate the impact of certain types of behavior that trigger us. Because in many cases in the workplace, you can't always remove yourself from personalities like that. You just have to find ways of reducing and minimizing the exposure to personalities like that.
So I'd like to talk about that because I think that's a very important subject and starts to intersect with the business part of it, if you will. And what I'd like to ask about that, first of all, is that given that you know these things about yourself, how do you entirely take it upon yourself to minimize your exposure to these triggers? Or do you kind of try to work with the people that you're involved with and say, hey, look, I sort of have this thing going on, and these 4 things are really not good, and I'd like to try to avoid those in this environment as much as possible. Can you have conversations like that? Am I just sort of off the reservation?
If I care enough about the person and respect the person enough, quite honestly, Mike, yeah, I'll take the trouble to do that.
Okay.
Because honestly, let me give you an analogy, and perhaps this will become clear. If someone is being abusive or discriminatory toward me, it is not my responsibility to tell them that they are and to teach them some other way. I don't think it's my responsibility, and I don't want to carry that burden. That's me personally. Now, I know other people who would. However, if I care and I respect the person enough to want to continue to have a relationship with that person, an ongoing, sustainable relationship with that person, then I would, because I want a sustainable, ongoing relationship. Then the amount of investment that I would have to make warrants that, the outcome warrants the investment, because it's a big investment. It is very difficult. So first of all, that person has to have some semblance of empathy.
Yeah. You don't have that, it's a non-starter, right?
Correct. One of the primary reasons why assholes are assholes, Mike, is because they lack empathy and self-awareness. And they, and I have in my years have come to the conclusion that some people just can't help themselves. And who am I to go help them stop being an asshole? So I'm just going to work with them as best as the situation calls for to get the job done, to accomplish the goal, and move on. That's how I cope. That's my coping mechanism. There is too much energy. It would take too much energy for me to manage my disorder and to try and change these people. The situation would be quite different if a person is exhibiting these behavioral traits, these less than desirable behavior traits, but has some semblance of empathy. They just don't know it. Okay, they don't know what they're doing. But if I thought that if they did know what they were doing, it's the impact of their behavior on others, that they would consider a different way. If I even detected that and I wanted a sustained relationship with these people, I would make the investment. And yes, I would absolutely say, look, and I would frame it from the standpoint of, I have a mood disorder. That too it's a very self-centric thing, and that's just not my style. I would frame it from the standpoint of, look, when you say these kinds of things in this sort of a situation, you may not mean it this way, but let me tell you how it's being perceived.
Okay.
And if this is not the way you want it to be perceived, then let's find a better way of articulating your thoughts.
Okay.
And that's how I would do it.
So beyond this particular approach, which is a very sort of, let's call it individualized or even a non-scalable approach, right? Because that's to be focused one person at a time.
Yes.
And I think that's part of where the ROI equation comes in that you're describing. Are there other things that you need to do to kind of protect yourself? For example, I would imagine, because you said that a good sleep schedule is essential to managing your condition, right? So that, to me, that says it would be very difficult for you to be in a culture that thrives on the all-nighter, right? That's just not, it sounds like that's something that could be not only suboptimal, but potentially even dangerous for you.
Yes. And actually when I violate my no asshole rule and I allow myself to be consumed by a let's work an all-nighter type of culture, is when I get into trouble. I literally get myself very sick. And so yes, there's a measure of protection that I have to put around myself, boundaries. So This is where boundaries come in. And people without the bipolar disorder have boundaries. So now, what is really interesting, I think, in my situation, that I think is worth noting for your listeners who may find themselves in a similar situation is I am naturally a high performance, hard charging individual.
Agreed.
That is my nature.
Yep. I've seen it.
Unfortunately, my nature is hurtful to my condition. So I have to fight my default and learn a new default. And so what I've done is learning a new default is, well, perhaps, old dogs can't learn new tricks, as the saying goes. Learning a new default maybe it has proven to be too difficult. So what I've done is I've created extensions to the default.
Okay.
So, it's like home improvement. I've added extensions and caveats to the default where, yes, when it is absolutely necessary, I will work the 80-hour week, but I will not work the 80-hour week I would work it for a week, maybe two at most. And then I have to go back to a 40, 50-hour week, which is a normal week for me. And, or I take a mental health day. You hear people say that all the time where, you take a Friday and you just switch it off. Now, I have learned as a coping mechanism to turn off my phone and go off grid one day out of every weekend. So, you have a Saturday or a Sunday. So I either pick a Saturday or Sunday. Usually it's a Sunday where I completely go off grid and I do not check phone, emails, nothing. So that, it's kind of like an electronic detox, digital detox.
Well, a lot of things you're describing sound like they're probably pretty useful for people that aren't fighting bipolar disorder, frankly.
Yes.
I can tell you something I've started to become very mindful of is my own sleep schedule, because when you can operate in short sleep, it's a blessing and a curse, because it's a blessing because it allows you to do more. But for me, Parkinson's law just takes over. All it does, it allows me to outwork my mistakes. So, and that's not really an optimal place to be anyway. So, the way you describe, you describe these sort of parameters in a way that I think are consistent with kind of best practices for mental maintenance anyway.
Indeed. So many of the the measures that I've taken, anyone and everyone really should take if, regardless what sort of a workspace they're on, it really doesn't matter. I mean, so I'll be very specific. If you have a television in your bedroom, remove it. This is probably the hardest one for most people, because a lot of people I know seem to have televisions in their bedrooms. It's terrible. If you 8 hours of sleep. Now, some people need 8. I need 6 hours of sleep.
Yep.
6 good hours of sleep is sufficient for me. It's the quality of sleep more than the quantity of sleep. Doing something. So for me to process problems, I need to be doing something else. So this is the other thing about corporate America, is that it's not always forgiving about extracurricular activities. There are some cultures that don't condone an employee having nonprofit work or volunteer work, anything like that, where, they want you and all of you and, all of your time.
Right.
That does not, so I stay away from cultures like that, because that is not how I operate optimally. My optimal mode is the ability to problem solve at work, but I'm problem solving whilst I'm doing other things, other activities that are not work related, like organizing TEDxAtlanta. That actually helps me. It's invigorating. It's a very renewing process of organizing that endeavor. And it helps me process the other kind of work problems that I have, the revenue generating problems that I have to, that I'm helping to overcome and add value to. That is my mode. So I think people have to find what works for them. I'm describing what absolutely works for me in this instance. The whole sleep hygiene thing, absolutely, that works for everybody. That applies to everybody. The hours, that's individualized. Everyone has a sweet spot. And then finally, a lot of what happens that may not be obvious, is that people with bipolar disorder, when there is an episode and there's a true multi-week, multi-month episode of depression, what it does is it also completely obliterates your self-confidence. And one of the ways to rebuild self-confidence is to do volunteer work. So when I experienced the very long episode from February 2008 to 2009, July, August, was the way I slowly came back to the world, so to speak, was beyond the talk therapy, beyond the medication, beyond the group support sessions every 2 weeks, every month. I also began to volunteer at actually St. Vincent de Paul in this case. And where I just, something as simple as stocking shelves at the food bank. At the food pantry. So it was rebuilding a sense of confidence is really, really important in the recovery process as well. And making and engaging in activities that reinforce your sense of self when you're not in an episode, when things are being managed, when your condition's being managed, is also very important.
So one question I want to make sure to get to is and I'm curious about this for myself, because I as a manager, as a leader, I may encounter this, and that is if somebody that were in my charge were to approach me and sort of close the door and just say, hey, look, I've got this issue. I've got this issue of bipolar disorder. And I just want to let you know about it, because some things you may not expect to happen might happen, or I may have specific needs or to help manage it. What's the best way for me to react to that? Should I react to it? Should I
Wow.
hand them off to HR? I mean, how can I engage constructively in that conversation?
Wow, that's a tough one, Mike, because you're now wandering into labor laws and HR and all of that. That's a tough one. So I'll tell you how I've reacted in the past to team members who come to me to say, whose work performance had visibly, obviously fallen off. And I've had this conversation. It was, I initiated a conversation, and then they tell me that there have been a series of deaths in the family, and they were just not feeling well, and so on and so forth. So first of all, regardless of what your HR policy is about this, I think it's important to just listen. Sometimes the best action is no action. And sometimes, the person that may just want to be heard. People don't consider that. I mean, there may not be an action necessary. The person they just want to be heard. Because it's very lonely when you're experiencing symptoms. You feel like you're the only one in the world feeling it when it's not true, but your brain is telling you that you're the only one. So just being an ear and not committing to anything, not saying anything, and just understanding and showing kindness and empathy. That sometimes can be enough.
I really like that. And it reminds me actually of a quote from Art of War that suggests that one of the hardest things to do, but the best thing to do, is simply nothing. I'm paraphrasing. It's really one of the hardest things to do in battle is wait. But it translates very well there, that sometimes the best thing to do is just nothing. And for somebody like me who prefers to be proactive and frankly would like to help, somebody comes to me with something like that, my first instinct is how can I help? Even though I am patently unqualified to help somebody, right? I don't have that condition. I don't have medical training. I read what I read on the internet, half of which is probably wrong. But I think that's a really good piece of advice. I really do. It's surprisingly hard.
Yes, it is. So listening, being heard is oftentimes the best answer for the person across the table who is sharing something that is very difficult for them to share. Making sure that they feel heard is possibly the best gift that you can give them as a manager. Now, I think, though, if the situation would be different if you are sensing that they could possibly hurt themselves.
Right.
They could be in that state. Now, you never know. Okay, so first of all, you never know.
Yep.
But if you even have a glimmer of that, then it's time to have a conversation with your HR group to just to better understand all the different angles.
We're talking with Jacqui Chew, and the topic is, should I be open about my mental illness? And and that conversation is adjacent to something that I started a conversation about in our company about 3 years ago, not long after I joined, actually. And this is in the wake of the Ohio State scandal, where one coach was abusing his wife and other coaches knew and apparently didn't do anything, certainly not enough to kind of intervene in that. And the question I asked and still ask, because there's really no great answer, is, as an employer, as a leader, if I hear something like that in my firm, right? What are my obligations, both ethical and legal? What are my constraints, both ethical and legal? And I think what you just described is actually quite adjacent to that. So we need to wrap up here. We could do this for a lot longer, but we have limited time, and I want to be respectful of the rest of your day. But I am curious about one thing. In the 15, 16 years that you've struggled with this and have become an advocate for awareness, do you think that as a society we've gotten better at acknowledging the importance, severity, and impact of mental illness?
Unequivocally, yes. And it's been accelerated by the onset of COVID. Ironically, COVID has affected such a large swath of the population in terms of the isolation, the social distancing and isolation that having such a profound impact on a person's psyche, and for many people, that it has given those of us who were diagnosed before, who have diagnosed conditions, it's given us a broader audience. There's more empathy. There's less likelihood of the other person saying, "Oh, it's all in your head."
Right.
Or
what a stupid
less
thing to say.
Well, people say it.
There's no shortage of stupid things for people to say, but go on.
There you go. Or this notion that if you take a series of pills and you go to your doctor, you'll be fine. Because the pandemic has affected so many people in so many different ways that there's a really good chance if you talk to your neighbor, they know someone in their family, or they know someone, in their second ring of peers or friends and associates who've been affected by the pandemic from a mental health point of view. So my point is, mental health issues are more prevalent as a result of the pandemic. And therefore the conversation around it is just more mainstream. COVID has mainstream mental health and the challenges and the symptoms and the problems. And there's a distinct volume of conversation that's happening on social media, on Clubhouse, on Twitter. Even at TED, I spent my lunchtime listening and watching a whole panel of iconic TED speakers as part of this thing that TED puts together. And Monica Lewinsky was there, and she's a huge advocate for mental health and normalizing the conversation around mental health. She shares my vision and my wish that, I wish that it could be a dinner table conversation, just like diabetes, like talking about, how's your dad's diabetes coming along? How's he managing it? Is he exercising? I wish we could talk about, how's your brother's, mental mood disorder coming along? Is he getting the sleep he needs? I would love to see that happen. And I think we are closer. We're not there, but we're closer because of the pandemic.
I think that's a great place to put a pin in this and wrap it up. And maybe we'll do a part two at some point. I only got through about half the questions, but that's fine. How can people contact you for more information about this? Maybe just to share their journey or get your advice.
Sure. So I'm active on Facebook. It's just Jacqui Chew. I'm also active on LinkedIn, also Jacqui Chew. And I have a website, JacquiChew.com.
Yep. As you can tell, Jacqui is not an introvert. She is not hard to find. And that's going to wrap it up for today's program. And I'd like to thank Jacqui so much for joining us and sharing her expertise with us. And on a side note, frankly, just for having the courage to be this advocate. I am confident that it has helped a lot of people over the way. And I'm equally confident it's going to help at least a few listeners to this program. We'll be exploring a new topic each week, so please tune in so that when you're faced with your next business decision, you have clear vision when making it. If you enjoy these podcasts, please consider leaving a review with your favorite podcast aggregator. It helps people find us so that we can help them. If you'd like to engage with me on social media with my chart of the day and other content, I'm on LinkedIn as myself and @Unblakeable on Facebook, Twitter, Clubhouse, and Instagram. Once again, this is Mike Blake. Our sponsor is Brady Ware & Company, and this has been the Decision Vision Podcast.